All right, so we'll talk a little bit today about the common law and how its changes are made, so where these different laws come from and then how the courts can change them through some of the decisions they make. We'll talk about what statutory law is, and we're going to do an activity today to understand how new laws are made. Because the law is such a guiding factor in society today, you need to understand the process, and it's a lengthy one. Understanding the reasons that new bills are proposed. So before it becomes a law, it's called a bill. A number of bills are proposed that never become a law. And so you'll see the process for that and then what goes on if it can actually become a law. We'll look at how we interpret statutes. So this is big. The laws are always unclear, which makes no sense, right? I generally think attorneys should be good writers. We learn a lot of research and writing skills, especially at the law school, but going forward from that. Even with that being the case and with them being some of the people involved in the law writing process, one word can make a big difference and a lot of things can be unclear. So I want to give you an example of that. In D.C., Washington, D.C., which is near here, is it okay to smoke marijuana legally? Yeah. So we talked about how that's changing, right? I'm talking about drugs because you're right. It's an easy way to get you to pay attention at this time of day. Like, why is Professor Weiser talking about drugs? I told you, sex, drugs, and alcohol in this class. I'll keep you interested. So marijuana is okay in D.C. When they wrote the law, they said it was okay to smoke marijuana if you were in a private place. Okay? If you were in a private place, you could smoke marijuana. So can I go to the National Mall, sit on, the Lincoln Memorial and smoke marijuana? Why not?
It's
It's a public place, right? So that's easy, right? Don't go smoking out in public. So where can I smoke marijuana?
in your house.
In my home. Anywhere else?
The car.
The car's my private spot probably matters where it's parked. So if it's parked in front of the Lincoln Memorial, if it's in front of my house, it's another story. But where else can I smoke?
What about a business that you own?
Interesting. A business I own. So this is where we talk about the law being unclear in terms of interpretation. If it's a business you own, it's your private space. Yeah, depending on the type of business, you could probably smoke marijuana in it. In fact, when that law first came out, bars, they're private property, right? Someone owns that, just like you own your house, So they actually allowed their business customers to smoke marijuana in the bar. Because the way the law was written, that was okay to do, right? Private place, you can smoke marijuana. But do you think what they intended when they wrote the law? Not at all. So they quickly were like, oh no, that was not what we meant. And they made, a little bit of an amendment to that law to make sure that you could not smoke marijuana in D.C. in the bars that were there. So, the way you write the law can make a big difference. Go ahead, yeah.
But, isn't a bar considered a public place also?
That's what they wanted it to be. They were like, this is supposed to be a public place, but because it was private property, it wasn't the National Mall, it was open to interpretation. So how we interpret that law, you could argue it's private property because someone owns it or rents it. And so people started allowing that to happen inside their bar, and it caused some issues. Now, the purpose of the law was to not allow it. They consider that a public space, so they just made it a little more clear. Bars are not included. We're going to talk a bit about administrative law today, and we'll also look at the power of different agencies in this area. Now, this is a big thing for all of you as you're studying business and depending on what you end up doing for your career. Because we are in the D.C. area where all the federal agencies are housed, a lot of the jobs that they're recruiting you for will end up in some of these agencies. Even if you don't want to work in federal government, if you work for some of the consulting and professional firms, their clients are usually federal government, just the nature of where we are. So it's good to be familiar with kind of what these agencies are and some of what they do. So at the very top here, we're talking today about the common law. And this is not new. You've seen this before. Common law is this idea of law being created through the courts, through the decisions that they make in the court. And that goes back to that word that starts with a P. What was it again?
Precedent.
Precedent. Okay, so the whole idea of stare decisis, meaning let's let the decision stand. Okay, through precedent, we can know, hey, this law actually means this. So, for example, going back to that marijuana law, if someone decided to let somebody smoke marijuana in the bar, you can say, hey, this violates the law. They end up in court. In the court, the judges can say, no, you know what? A bar is outside, and so this is going to be something that violates the law, and that's how we would know under the common law that marijuana should not be smoked inside a bar or restaurant. So these prior cases, they allow some flexibility, but also some predictability in the law. So because we know what happened in the past, we can kind of decide what will happen going forward. It's flexible, though. Do you have to follow what the court held before? No, so the courts can change the rules. Just because the Supreme Court said one thing doesn't mean they can't change their mind later. And as society changes, we can see a lot of those changes happening as well. So just a couple of things to think about in terms of that. Now, changes in the law we'll talk about in just a moment. I want to show you an example of how the law can be changed. So they come out with a law, and then what happens is the courts make changes to it by interpreting it. So here's an example of where that happened. This case is a famous case. If you know anyone in the who's a therapist or a social worker, this is something big that changed the way that profession worked. It's known as Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California. So looking at just the titles, is this a criminal or civil case? University of California, is that a government agency? Yeah, okay, so University of California is what? It's a college, right? Yeah, it's a college. So here we have a business, a person, an organization. So as a college versus Tarasoff as a person, is this a criminal or a civil case? Civil. So I think a lot of you said criminal because you saw up here someone killed somebody, right? If you read forward, you're like, someone killed someone, that's murder. That's not what it's at issue in this case. Remember, if there's something like a murder, the government can go after you looking to get some jail time, right? So we can see, we'd see a state name up there. We'd see California versus Tarasoff there. Here, what's Tarasoff looking for? Money. Okay, so here we're talking about a civil issue. There's a wrong that's been done to these private parties, and we're trying to figure out how can we come to a resolution. Here it's money. The reason I point that out, we're going to see Potter, he's the killer. He killed Tatiana Tarasoff. Okay, so the murder, we know this happened. Why do we not see Potter, the killer, in the title? Potter's the killer, Tarasoff's the person that died. Why is Potter not the one on trial? Why do we see a college instead?
I think she's a worker.
Yeah, perfect. A worker. It could be a worker at the college. Go ahead, Michael.
Aren't they going after the college because, like it says on the board, the psychologist knew that Potter had the intent to kill her?
Good. So here we have an issue. We have the killer is Potter. If you look on the board here, as Mikey pointed out, Dr. Moore worked for the organization. Thank you, Yao. So we have an employee of the organization who they're saying, you did something wrong, employee. Why aren't they going after the employee? Why are they going after the college? Thank you, Aklima. Throughout the semester, you'll see when we're talking about civil cases, often they'll be going after a business that the employee worked for, or the universities, or different organizations the employees work for. And the idea is, as Aklima said, they want more money. So there's deeper pockets. They can go after Dr. Moore. He probably makes an average of $50,000 a year and just doesn't have that much money to give. If they're looking for a lot of money, they're going to focus on University of California. They'll be able to actually win something in court. If I go to court against Mikey, he has $0 in his bank account, and I win $1 million, I'm not going to be able to get very much. Okay? And he probably, do you own a home right now?
I do not.
Okay, so he doesn't own a home, so I can't really get a lien on his house. Do you have a car?
It's cheap.
So besides maybe getting his car that's cheap, I'm not really getting a lot. Even though I won in court. Okay, I win. The judge says, Mikey, pay $1 million. If he doesn't have $1 million, worst thing I can do is throw him in jail. And if he's in jail, can he make a lot of money? To pay me, no. So that's why in these civil cases, we'll learn later in agency law, often they'll go after the person who has the deeper pockets. That's why we see the college here. So now that we have that foundation, we're looking at this guy Potter who killed Tatiana Tarasoff. We see it's Tarasoff's parents that are claiming that 2 months earlier, Potter, the killer, had confided in his therapist, this guy Dr. Moore. That he's a psychologist employed at the University of California at Berkeley. So that's why we see them on trial. They sue the university. Okay, the victim who died, her parents are suing the university, claiming that Dr. Moore should have warned her or arranged in some way for Potter to be confined because he said, I'm going to kill her. The issue here isn't whether or not Potter did kill her. The issue is what? Should the doctor have said something? If you're a psychologist and you have a patient in your office and they say, I'm going to kill Professor Weiser, is it the responsibility then of the psychologist to say something? So this is where we see changes in the law. I've mentioned before, on a legal basis, when we talk about law and ethics, on a legal basis, are you generally required to to do anything? If you drive by someone and they look like they're in a car, it's on fire, they look like they're gonna die, are you legally obligated to help them?
No.
So should a psychologist be legally obligated under the law? Are they legally obligated to do anything? Not the way the law is written. Oh no, Sean's like, why? What are you about to say, Sean? Go ahead.
Don't get it. Like if
I
I tell
mean,
you, if I tell you
humanly,
my
you should say
intent is to
something.
harm someone, regardless if you're a cop or anybody, you should at least let someone know.
So if you say that to Dustin, who's in front of you, should he say something?
If I'm serious, like that's another. If I'm serious about it, then yeah.
But
That's
that's
serious.
moral. That's moral.
If I'm serious about it, yeah, go
That's
ahead.
not wrong.
That's moral. You know, your morals should tell you to do, but that doesn't mean, like the law, is written in a way that you have to, like tell the authorities.
So Yasmin, a really good point. Throughout the semester, the law is not fair, right? The law says you don't have to do anything. Y'all saying you should do, maybe you should do something. The law says no. Mikey, go ahead, and then Dustin.
Branching off of that, morally he should tell her, but doesn't it breach doctor-patient confidentiality as well?
Oh, so there's a bigger issue here. So Sean's, saying something to Dustin, and Dustin saying something is one thing as his friend, but what if it's this relationship where you have a doctor and a patient, and you're supposed to be able to talk to them and get help? There's a little bit of confidentiality there. Well, should they be able to break that privacy, breach that confidentiality, to go tell someone, hey, you said you're going to kill? So Sean, you made a really good, I'm sorry, Dustin next, and then I'll go back to Sean. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's hard to form a trusting relationship with your therapist if you can't be open and honest about like your thoughts and feelings.
Absolutely, it kind of defeats the purpose of that profession. You're supposed to be able to share what's going on so they can help you. It's this third objective party, and they can't help you if you're having to kind of censor what you're saying in that room. So Sean, you made a really good point. Do you want to make it again? Okay, regarding here, you said they should tell you if you say I'm going to kill if it's what? The intent. Do you think people say I'm going to kill someone and they don't always do it? That happens a lot. I'm going to kill, and then they don't mean it. They say it, but when you really come down and doing it, you're like, it's a little rough. I don't want to go that far. That was something the judge talked about with you in the courtroom. At some point, there's usually this like regret, where you're going. Even someone who thinks they want to murder someone, before they actually do it, often they'll turn around and not do it. Okay, so here, when someone says I'm going to kill somebody, how do they know they're serious? Sean said they're serious. They intend to do it. So that was the big question in this case. Legally, they're not doing anything. Okay, but also, do we even know that they were going to do anything just because they said it?
Like, what if the person showed other symptoms or signs?
What if they showed other symptoms or signs? So Sean's pointing out some really important stuff. Legally, they don't have to say anything. But even if they do legally have to say something, when? At what point during that conversation, if someone just says, I'm going to kill, do you say something? If someone says, I'm going to kill 3 times, do you say something? If someone says, I'm going to kill, and they say, I purchased a gun on this date, then do you say something? So that's the big question. And if you see these different deaths that have happened in the news, for example, recently we saw the one in Vegas. You see a shooter who does something terrible. The question's often, who knew? How were they able to bring all these guns upstairs? How were they able to do all this? They're looking to see, did someone know, should someone have said something sooner? Did our government know this person was a risk? Did their friends and family know? And you see a lot of that attention in the media. Go ahead.
I was going to say they should give the disclaimer before they talk to them, so if anything like that comes up, they stop the session immediately and then notify.
It's tough, if you're having feelings, like if I'm having, I use my husband as an example because I don't want to kill any of my students as an example. It's just not a good way to do things. So if I say I want to kill my husband just because I'm feeling that way in that moment, I probably don't really want to murder him. But I might have that conversation with my therapist so we can talk about why I'm feeling that way and saying those things. It doesn't mean I intend it. And so here, in terms of our duties, this is where we see some changes in the law. Okay? Again, the law is, do you have to do anything? No. But there's some issues that we all just talked about where, hey, something serious happened. We want to try to prevent death if we can. And then on top of that, we want to make sure people are still having privacy and having a productive conversation with their therapist.
Don't the doctors have an obligation to say anything?
They do now. So now the doctors have an obligation. This is an example of how we see the law changing. In general, the law is you don't have to do anything, but now, that's what the law states, the statute says. But in this case, we saw a change in it. They're saying specifically in a relationship between a therapist, a psychologist, and their patient. If somebody really is reasonably sure determines they posed a serious threat of violence to others, then they have a duty to say something.
they figure out it's reasonable?
Great question,
Exactly.
Katsumi. How do you figure out it's reasonable? So that's the big question. And so what you would do in court is you'd bring in another therapist, someone in that same profession, to say, if you have a record where they said, I'm going to kill 3 times, if they've done this before, they're going to look to various facts, like Sean mentioned earlier. Did they actually go get a gun? Did they pull up to the person's house? Have they made a plan to commit the murder? They're going to look to these different facts, and that's how they're going to say whether or not, if there was a similar patient under their care, they would think there was actually a threat. If it's someone who says, I'm going to kill my husband, and they say it every time, but they haven't for months and months and months, seems unlikely, another therapist might say no. And keep in mind, opinions can differ. So you could get one therapist on the stand saying, yes, this person posed a serious threat, and another could argue exactly the opposite with facts and information. I saw some hands up. Katsumi, go ahead.
So, a doctor or a psychologist has to ask his or her patient about details.
If they think that you pose a serious threat to others, you have a duty to say something, despite confidentiality.
Yeah, isn't threatening their lives? I mean, the doctors and psychologists, because they're into they're going to involve I mean, if one is planning to kill somebody, which means they're attempting murders or something, right? So, in this kind of case, to figure out it's reasonably or not,
that's hard. That's the profession.
This is rule and this is law, right?
This is an example of a common law.
Yeah.
The law is stated, it says you have no obligation, but they've carved out an exception and said in this relationship.
So isn't this going to threaten doctors and psychologists?
It does. It does impact their lives. So if you know anyone in that profession, now they know that. If there is a serious threat to others, then it gives rise, they have an obligation to say something now because of this law. Now keep in mind, going back to this carved out an exception. Now we have what's called precedent, right? We have a prior case that says, hey, legally you don't have to do anything unless you're a doctor-patient. Well, now let's take it to a new example. A student comes to me and says, Professor Weiser, I'm going to kill Tarasov. Do I have to say something? I'm a faculty here. Do I have to say something?
Yes.
Why? The law says I don't.
It's probably in your
Doesn't the
contract.
college
You
have a
guys are
policy?
taking moral.
Go ahead, Elon.
Can't you be liable for it?
So Elon's going to make a good attorney argument and say, under this precedent, there's a special relationship between doctors and their patients. There's a similar relationship between faculty and their students. Okay, so we can use that precedent to our advantage. Now, if you want to help get me out of jail, anyone want to help get me out of jail? No, thanks, Sean. Sean said, sure. Thank you. Sean wants to help me get out of jail. He's going to use this precedent, and he's going to say it's different. A student-faculty relationship is not the same as a psychologist and a patient.
Because we don't everything that's going on in our lives, you just teach us.
Some of them do, but yeah, I meant to not. I should not be giving you therapy advice. So, in terms of the holding here, he's going to make an argument based on this precedent. This is specifically narrowed to a therapist and a patient, and it should not be extended to other special relationships. Okay, now that might work, it might not. One example, I'm going to jump forward here, right there. How we see changes in the law. Someone makes a case like that, where we see a change, where legally you don't have to do anything, but then they carve out an exception. That got extended, where they said, hey, based on this precedent, doctor-patient relationship, you have to say something. It got extended to the employer and employee relationship as well. In an emergency situation, most states will ask an employer to say something if their employee is in pain. Now here, you'll also see that some states are now making it an obligation to do something. While the law says you don't have to, states are starting to change that as we see issues coming up where
Yeah, I think
you could have stopped, you could have done something to help, and you chose not to. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I think I've seen the case where somebody was in a dire situation, a bystander didn't help, and the bystander was actually on trial for not helping out.
And certainly you can have a case, even if the law says you don't have to do anything, you can make a case and argue that they should. It's going to be hard to carve out these exceptions. You have to look at this precedent and say, well, the doctor-patient relationship, this should really be extended to everybody. It's how far we can extend that precedent. That's how we see changes in the common law. But I want to show you, oops, where did it go? Here we go. Maryland's Bystander Law. So this is state by state. I try to show you stuff having to do with Maryland. This is Maryland. This is Maryland's law that says we don't have to do anything. So again, the law's not always super, super clear. It'd be really easy if it just said legally you have no obligation to do something if someone's in danger. But it's too simple, right? So on the top here it says something like, a person described in subsection B of this section is not civilly liable in a civil case like we just saw for any act or omission if you fail to act. You're supposed to help and you choose not to. In giving any assistance or medical care, if it's not gross negligence, and we'll learn more about negligence when we get to our tort section, but if it's not something seriously wrong, if it can be provided, if it's provided without fee or other compensation. So here it's saying if you're a doctor, you would need to help. If it's the assistance or medical care is provided at the scene of an emergency in transit or through communications with personnel providing emergency assistance. Now here we see some exceptions. If you are a member of any state, county, municipal, or volunteer fire department, if you're on an ambulance or rescue squad, if you're law enforcement, well now you have to do something. So in our actual statute, we have some kind of rules in terms of generally the public doesn't have to, but there's some people that do need to help. Generally you're covered. You won't be civilly liable to provide medical aid to a victim at the scene of an emergency as long as you do so in a reasonably prudent manner. So if you do decide to help, be careful. Make sure you help them as a reasonable person would. What that means is, I try to give let me give you a clear example of this. Some of the cases that have come up around this have been someone out drinking heavily. They black out and they get injured and they're sitting outside in the snow. Officer Raymond, you come to help. You come to help. You say, hey, our friend Professor Weiser is blacked out in the snow and she needs help. We're going to take her and bring her to the emergency room and get her help. We've all been drinking. I don't want the emergency room to know that we're driving a vehicle to drop off Professor Weiser, so we're just going to throw her in front of the emergency room. We're not going to bring her inside. We don't want to get busted, right? Yeah, so you leave me in front of the medical hospital, someone will find her and she'll get help. Unfortunately, no one steps outside and I'm there overnight and I die, I freeze to death. Okay, that's an example of not being reasonably prudent. If you're going to help, just make sure you do a good job, okay? You don't have to save the world, but maybe don't leave them out in the freezing cold. Go ahead, Jeff.
I think I've heard a story of like someone who needed help and someone who wasn't a doctor like tried to give someone CPR who needed it and they like collapsed their lungs. So then that person like got on trial for murder or something like that.
What? So remember, they can bring a case against you and say like, hey, you didn't do a good job helping them, which is why this law's in place. Normally, you're protected as long as you tried to help and did an okay job, what a reasonable person would do. You know, if you're really kind of grossly negligent, you really don't do what you should do to help, you could run into a bad situation. You can be on trial. Remember, you're innocent until proven guilty, so you'll probably get off the hook in most cases. Curtis.
Well, would you be in trouble if you like brought, I guess, someone who's really drunk to the hospital and you're underage drinking, and clearly you're intoxicated, but you're trying to help her out? Would you be, I guess, arrested or in some sort of?
So that's a good question. So I gave the joke and I said you were an officer and they don't want to get caught. That is the situation that happens sometimes. A police officer has to be the one to say, hey, you know, you seem like you're drinking and driving, right? So you come into the emergency room, Curtis, you're a drunken person, and you're trying to help Curtis here, and you bring him in. Someone actually has to file charges against you and say you were drinking and driving. Okay, the state has to. It's not going to be the doctor at the hospital. If they start asking questions and find out you did that, they could report you, but really it's not like you're getting pulled over. It's not the same thing. So if you're bringing them to the hospital, you park the car and you walk inside, they don't have a ton of evidence that you were drinking and driving. And if they, at the hospital, say, can I give you a blood alcohol test, you can just say no and not give them the evidence they would need.
But you could self-incriminate yourself just through.
Not at the hospital. You're not talking to anyone at the hospital that you're going to cause a problem with. But if you say, hey, guess what? Emergency room. Everyone listen up. I saved Curtis's life. I drove him to the hospital, even though I'm drunk off my ass. Are you going to be okay? No. Then you could have someone calling the cops and reporting you because they're mad that you're drinking and driving. And then they could use that statement you made against you to say you were drinking and driving. If they don't have evidence, remember you're innocent until proven guilty. So all they have is that person's word versus your own. There's no blood test, blood alcohol test to show that.
Question. Okay, so remember you said that just say, you know, like kind of workers and all those, they have to report, you know, like things. Okay, for example, so you take the person to the hospital and, you know, sometimes the person's drunk, so, you know, the worker noticed that, okay, the way the person's walking, you know, but the person didn't say there wasn't any verbal, kind of like incrimination. But the way the person walking, the worker knows.
Remember, the hospital is not the police, okay?
Yeah, and then, the person
There are a
goes
lot
out.
of people that come in drunk to the emergency room at the hospital to get help, and they're gonna try to help you. Don't be afraid to go help your friends, okay? Just don't ask them to give you a blood alcohol test. And in general, if you need to bring your friend for help, if you're at a party and there's an emergency happening, you shouldn't get in a vehicle and drive. You shouldn't go with them to the hospital. Just don't drive them there. There's Uber, there's taxis, there's buses, there's free ride services, and on top of that, you can always just call an ambulance, okay, which is probably the right way to go. So, moral of the story, bring your friends to the hospital if they've been drinking. Don't be afraid you're going to get in trouble. Just don't shout to the emergency room that you've been drinking, right? And don't drive there when you do. We see changes in the law. That was an example to give you a little bit of an illustration how we see the law itself can be changed, exceptions carved out through the court system, even though they're not making the laws. The laws that are made are called statutory law. So statutory law, when new law gets written either at the state or federal level, Congress will actually write it out like we just saw. That was a statute we looked at, a Maryland statute that shows us our Good Samaritan law. Most new law is statutory. Legislation gets passed either at the state or level of Congress or the United States. We have some control over what laws get written because we get to elect the state congressional representatives and the United States senators and representatives. So what you'll see is sometimes the court is not the right place to try to get a law changed. You actually want to send letters, contact your state senator or one of the members of the House of Representatives to bring up the issue to get the law changed at the source. Remember, courts do not make law, although the interpretation obviously makes some big changes like we just saw. So I want to show you how the new laws are made. We're talking a lot about the law this semester. We just looked at an example of a statute. We saw the law. I want you to know how the process works. It's good to understand this because a lot of new bills get proposed. You hear about them in the news when something bad happens, and they don't always come into law. So there can be a lot of confusion about whether or not that's a rule you have to follow. Until it actually becomes a law, it's not, just because it's in process. So just so you know, any member of Congress, we talked about Congress last class, a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, they can initiate a bill. A bill is what a proposed law is. It's like a draft of the law. It then gets debated in a committee in the House where it's introduced, so either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. From the committee, it goes to the full House for a vote. If it passes both houses this way, it will go to the president for his signature. The president can veto it in full. They can say, nope, I don't want this law to come into place. But they can't just say, well, I like this part. I don't really like this part. I like this part, not this part. They have to either approve in whole or reject in whole. It's called a veto. So their signature, if they approve, will turn the bill into a law. If they reject it, we do have a balance in place. It'll kick back to Congress, and then they can have a 2/3 majority vote, which will turn it into law anyway. So President Trump has a little bit of a balance there in terms of how much he can control. So it's early. We're talking a lot about some of the details in the law. It's complicated. I'm going to show you a video to make sure you see this process and you remember it. One way to help you remember things in my law class is through song. No, I will not sing for you. I will spare you that awfulness. I'm going to show you a video that some of you may have seen before. Anyone heard of Schoolhouse Rock? I'm Just a Bill?
Yeah.
Some of you are going to hate me today because this is going to stuck in your head, but you will remember how the law is made.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Oh, God. Give me 1 second. I'll restart it. I just need to turn the volume up on my computer.
Oh Lord.
There we go.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long week while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, You're right, there ought to be a law. And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I'm still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live now. I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what
Then
happens?
I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill. He signed your bill. Now you're a law. Oh, yeah.
So excited he became a law. So some of you might have seen that already earlier. That was a good way for you to remember how a law gets made. We're also going to do an activity around this today because it is such an important part of our legal system. So let me pull that activity up. You have it in front of you. I'm going to put you into groups. You can meet some new people today. We're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law by making our own. So what I'm going to have you do in groups of no more than 5 students, I'll put you in those in just a moment. You're going to brainstorm problems happening. It can be here at Montgomery College, it can be in your community, it can be at a state level, or even as a nation. Okay, remember, law in the United States is restricted just to the United States. We'll talk more about that next class. So you want to write up a bill, a proposed law that will solve that problem. That's the hard part. You have to think about what language you would put into that proposed bill. Now, if you're going to say something like, all students need to ride the bus to school, well, which buses? Is the school going to provide the buses? How do you define a student? So think about the wording you're using. Then you're going to have an opportunity to present your bill to the class, and they'll be allowed to ask a few questions about the bill, which is what would happen in the normal system. You'd ask questions. Well, what does a student mean? What if it's someone who's dual enrollment, they're coming from the high school campus? Are they a Montgomery College student? The class will then have the opportunity to vote on your bill. Okay, it's a simple majority vote can get it forward to the president. I don't want to be president. I love being a professor, so I'll leave that to Trump. Who would like to be president today? Anyone? Klima, you get to be president, so she's going to be the one who gets to either reject your bill, okay, or she can approve it. If she rejects it, can you still make your bill a law? Yeah, if 2/3 of the class still wants it to go forward, we can get it to be a law. So I'm going to put you into the groups, a couple things to think about. Number one, the issue you want to address. Make it something that you care about, or this will be boring for you, and we want you to have a good, constructive, fun learning experience. Reasons your bill should be supported. So you're saying this should be a law. If I ask you, well, why? You should have at least a few reasons. Remember, a good attorney, you're going to start with your strongest reason first. So what's the strongest reason that should become a law? Then the other thing, a good attorney never walks into a courtroom thinking it's a slam dunk. If it was a slam dunk, you would have negotiated and settled outside of court, right? You never know what's going to happen with the judge or jury. So you want to be always prepared. This is in the business field as well. Always, when you're fighting with your significant other, be prepared for arguments they might make against you. Okay? And if I tell my husband I really want to have Italian food tonight, he's going to make an argument and say, we just had pizza Monday. I can say, yeah, but we had pizza, but there's other things we can have. I know it's coming, I can have things ready. Besides pizza, there's pasta at that restaurant, right? So you want to think about the challenges that someone might bring up and how you'd address them. they could be fair challenges that they're making, but how can you make them more comfortable and still win them over despite that? So that's where this bottom part is, potential challenges to your bill. And then at the very bottom, the language of the bill itself. Any questions at this activity? I'm going to put you into groups. I'm going to turn this off.